Hi guys! Sorry I haven't been here for the past couple days. Needed to take a little break, but I'm back with part 3 of our Stardusk Reads Redwall. So Clooney the Scourge has arrived at the Church of St. Ninians and made camp, and the Redwallers have heard that he's here, and they're planning their own preparations in case he attacks. So let's see what happens next. Chapter 8. Clooney the Scourge was having nightmares. He had lain down on the church mouse's bed for a well-earned rest, while his army was going about its allotted tasks. He should never have tried to sleep on an empty stomach, but weariness overcame his hunger. In Clooney's dream, everything was shrouded in red mist. The cries of his victims rang out as barns blazed and ships foundered on a stormy Red Sea. Cattle bellowed in pain as he battled with the pike that had taken his eye. The warlord thrashed about, killing, conquering, and laying waste to all in his dream. Then the phantom figure appeared. At first it seemed a small thing, a mouse, in fact, dressed in a long hooded robe. Clooney did not relish meeting with it. He could not tell why, but the mouse kept getting closer to him. For the first time in his life, he turned and ran. Clooney went like a bat out of hell. Glancing back, he saw all the carnage, death, and misery he had caused in his career. The big rat laughed insanely and ran faster, on, past scenes of desolation and destruction wreaked by him, Clooney the Scourge. Floating through the red mists, he could still see the strange mouse hard on his heels. Clooney felt himself filled with hatred for his pursuer. It seemed to have grown larger. Its eyes were cold and grim. Deep inside, Clooney knew that he could not frighten this oddly garbed mouse. Now it was wielding a large, bright sword, an ancient weapon of terrible beauty. The battle-scarred blade had a word written upon it that he could not make out. Sweat dripped from Clooney's claws like stinging acid. He stumbled. The strange figure was closer. It had grown into a giant. Clooney's lungs felt as if they were bursting. He realized that he had slowed up, and the mouse was getting closer. He tried to put on an extra burst of speed, but his legs would not obey. They ran more and more slowly, more and more heavily. Clooney cursed aloud at his leaden limbs. He saw he was trapped in deep, icy mud. For the first time, he knew the meaning of mindless fear and panic. He turned slowly. Too late. The enemy was upon him. He was rooted, helpless, to the spot. The avenging mouse swung sword up high. A million lights flashed from its deadly blade as it struck. Bong! The loud toll of a distant Joseph bell brought Clooney whirling back from the realms of nightmare to cold reality. He shivered, wiping the sweat from his fur with a shaky claw. Saved by the bell. He was puzzled. What did the fearful dream mean? Clooney had never been one to put his faith in omens, but this dream, it had been so lifelike and vivid that he shuddered. A timid paw tapping on the door snapped Clooney from his reverie with a start. It was Ragier and Mangefur, his scavengers. They slunk into the room, each trying to hide behind the other, knowing that the poor results of their search were likely to incur the chief's wrath. Their assumptions were correct. Clooney's baleful eye watched them as his long, flexible tail sorted through the paltry offerings which had dropped from their claws. A few dead beetles, 2 large earthworms, some unidentifiable vegetation, and the pitiful carcass of a long-dead sparrow. Clooney smiled at Ragier and Mangefur. With a sigh of relief, they grinned back at him. The chief was in a good mood. At lightning speed, the big rat's claws shot out and grabbed them both cruelly by the ears. The stupid hench-rats yowled piteously as they were lifted bodily from the floor and swung to and fro. In a fit of rage, Clooney bashed their heads together. Half senseless, they were hurled towards the doorway, with his angry words ringing in their skulls. Beetles, worms, rotten sparrows, get me meat! Tender, young, red meat! Next time you bring me rubbish like this, I'll spit the pair of you and have you roasted in your own juices. That clear?" Mainsford pointed an accusing claw at his companions. "Please, Chief, it was Raggear's fault. If we'd gone across the fields instead of up the road—" "Don't believe that big fat liar, Chief. It was him who suggested going up the road, not me." "Get out!" The scavengers dashed off, bumping clumsily into each other with panic as they tried to get through the door together. Clooney slumped back on the bed and snorted impatiently. Frogblood and Scumnose were next to report. They bore news that cheered Clooney up somewhat. They'd obtained over 100 new recruits, mainly rats, but with a good scattering of ferrets and weasels and the odd stoat. There had been some who needed convincing. These had been press-ganged by a savage beating from Frogblood, coupled with the threat of horrible death. They were soon convinced that the wisest course was to enlist in Clooney's horde. Others were hungry nomads, only too willing to join up with the infamous Clooney. They were greedy for plunder and booty and pleased to be on what they were sure would be the winning side. Lined up in the churchyard, the recruits were supplied with weaponry by Redtooth and Darkclaw. Impassively they stood in ranks, waiting for the warlord's inspection. Clooney nodded his approval. Scurvy rats, hungry ferrets, sly weasels, bad stoats, exactly what he needed. "Read him the articles, Redtooth," he snapped. Redtooth swaggered back and forth on the churchyard paving as he recited the formula from memory. "Right, eyes front. You're in the service of Clooney the Scourge now, me buccos. Desert and you'll be killed. Retreat and you're under sentence of death. Disobey and you'll die. I'm Redtooth, Clooney's #1 rat. You'll obey the word of your captains. They take orders from me, I take orders from Clooney. Remember that. Now, if any one, two, or a group of you all together want to try and beat Clooney and lead the horde, this is your chance." Without warning, Clooney charged headlong into the new recruits, lashing out wildly with his scourging tail. He bowled them left, right, and center with his massive strength. Baring his teeth and slitting his eye, he whipped fiercely away until they fell back and scattered in disorder, hiding behind gravestones. Clooney threw back his head and roared with laughter. "No guts, eh? Ha! It's just as well. I don't want dead uns on my claws before I find a proper battle for you to fight. And make no mistake, when the right time comes, I'll see you fight, aye, and die too. Now raise your weapons and let's see if you know who your master is." A motley collection of evil-looking implements was framed by the cloudless sky as wild cries rang out from the newly inducted recruits. "Clooney! Clooney! Clooney the Scourge!" Chapter 9. Abbot Mortimer and Constance the Badger meandered through the grounds together. Both creatures were deep in thought. Had they spoken and voiced their thoughts, they would have mentioned the same subject, the safety of Redwall. Down long ages, the beautiful old Abbey had stood for happiness, peace, and refuge to all. Diligent mice tended the neat little vegetable patches, which every season gave forth an abundance of fresh produce: cabbages, sprouts, marrows, turnips, peas, carrots, tomatoes, lettuces, and onions, all in their turn. Flower beds, heady and fragrant with countless varieties of summer blooms, from rose to humble daisy, were planted by the mice and husbanded by the hard-working bee folk, who in their turn rewarded Redwall with plentiful supplies of honey and beeswax. The two friends wandered onwards past the pond. Early morning sunlight glinted off the water, throwing out ripples from the fish caught by the overnight lines, which were baited and left to drift each evening by Brother Alf. Ahead of them lay the berry hedges, raspberry, blackberry, bilberry, and the strawberry patch, where every August sleepy baby creatures could be seen, their stomachs full after eating the pick of the crop. Gradually they made their way around the big old chestnut trees in the orchard. This was the abbot's favorite spot. Many a leisurely nap had he taken on sunny afternoons with the aroma of ripening fruit hovering in his whiskers. Apples, pears, quince, plums, damsons, even a vine of wild grapes. On the warm red stone of a south-facing wall, Old Mother Nature's blessing lay upon a haven of warm friendliness. Now, with the threat of Clooney upon Redwall, the two old friends assessed the beauteous bounty of their lifelong abode. Sweet birdsong on the still air tinged Constance's heart with sorrow and regret that this peaceful existence would soon pass. Gruffly, she snuffled deep in her throat, blinking off a threatening teardrop. The abbot sensed his companion's distress. He patted the badger's rough coat with a gentle paw. There, there, old girl. Don't fret. Many times in our history has tragedy been forestalled by miraculous happenings. Constance grunted in agreement, not wishing to disillusion her trusting old friend. Deep within her, she knew a dark shadow was casting itself over the Abbey. Furthermore, it was happening in the present, not in bygone days of fabled deeds. Matthias seated himself to an early breakfast in Cavern Hole, nut bread, apples, and a bowl of fresh goat's milk. Cornflower, along with other woodland creatures granted sanctuary, was sleeping in makeshift quarters provided by the good mice of Redwall. Matthias felt that he had grown up overnight. Duty was a mantle that he had taken willingly upon his shoulders. If there were a threat to Redwall from outside, it must be dealt with. The mice of Redwall were peaceful creatures, but that must not be taken as a sign of weakness. Stolidly, he munched away as he confronted the problem. Eat heartily, Matthias. No point in facing trouble on an empty stomach. Feed the body, nourish the mind. The young mouse was surprised to see that old brother Methuselah had been watching him, his eyes twinkling behind his curious spectacles he invariably wore. The ancient mouse sat down at the breakfast table with a small groan. Don't look so surprised, young one. Your face is an open book to one of my years. Matthias drained the last of the milk from his bowl, wiping cream from his whiskers with the back of a paw. Give me your advice, brother Methuselah, he said. What would you do? The old mouse wrinkled his nose. Exactly the same thing as you would, that is, if I were younger and not so old and stiff. Matthias felt he had found an ally. You mean you would fight? Methuselah rapped the table with a bony paw. Of course I would. It's the only sensible course to take. He paused and stared at Matthias in an odd manner. You know, there's something about you, young fella. Did you ever hear the story of how Martin the warrior first came to Redwall? Matthias leaned forward eagerly. Martin? Tell me, brother, I love hearing about the warrior monk. Methuselah's voice dropped to a secretive whisper. It is written in the great chronicles of Redwall that Martin was very young to be such a warrior. He could have been the same age as yourself, Matthias. Like you, he was impulsive and had a great quality of youthful innocence about him when he first came to our Abbey. But it is also written that in times of trouble, Martin had the gift of a natural leader, a command over others far superior to him in age and experience. The chronicle says that they looked to Martin as some look to a strong father. Matthias was full of wonderment, but he couldn't help but feel puzzled. Why do you tell all this to me, brother Methuselah? The old mouse stood up. He stared hard at Matthias for a moment, then, turning, he shuffled slowly off. As he went, he called over his shoulder, Because, Matthias, because he was very like you. Before the young mouse could question the old one further, the Joseph bell tolled out a warning. Sandals flapping, Matthias dashed out into the grounds, nearly colliding with the abbot and Constance, who, like everyone else, were heading for the gatehouse. Brothers Rufus and George had an incident to report. A large, evil-looking rat, covered in tattoos and carrying a rusty cutlass, had turned up at the gate. He had tried to gain entry by pretending he was injured. Limping about, the rat explained that he had been in a hay cart that overturned into the ditch. Would they come with him and render assistance to his friends, many of whom were lying trapped beneath the cart, crying out for help? Brother Rufus was no fool. How many rats were traveling in the cart altogether, he asked. "Oh, a couple of hundred," came the glib reply. "Then why," reasoned Brother Rufus, "did the rats not give aid to their own companions? Surely all 200 were not trapped." The rat evaded the question and made a great show of rubbing his injured leg. Could they not take him in and dress his wound, and perhaps give him a bite to eat at least? Brother George agreed on condition that the rat surrender his weapon. The rat made as if to do so, then suddenly lunged at Brother George, only to be sent sprawling by a blow from Brother Rufus's staff. Realizing that he was up against two big, competent mice who would stand no nonsense, he became abusive and bad-mouthed. "Ha! Just you wait, mice," he raged. "There's a whole army of us camped down in the church. When I tell Clooney how you treated me, ho, just wait, that's all. We'll be back, by the fang we will." With that he slunk off, cursing all mice. The grim news was digested in silence by the assembled creatures. Mrs. Churchmouse began sobbing. "Oh, dear me, did you hear that? Let's hear they must be living in our home at St. Ninian's Church. Oh, whatever shall we do? Our dear little home, full of dreadful rats." Mr. John Churchmouse tried to comfort his wife as best he could. There, hush now, missus. Better to lose a house than lose our lives. A good job we got sanctuary here at Redwall." "But what about other creatures in the area?" cried Matthias. "Sensible mouse," said Constance. Is Ambrose Spike anywhere about? He'd better do the rounds and tell them to take sanctuary here at the Abbey as quickly as possible. Spike will come to no harm. Once he curls up, there's nothing can touch him." This idea was greeted with enthusiasm. Brother Alf went off to find the old hedgehog. The abbot suggested they all go inside the Abbey and await further developments. Matthias piped up again. "We'd best mount a guard on the walls." One of the older mice, Sister Clemens, chided Matthias as an upstart. Her voice was stern and condescending. "Novice Matthias, you will be silent and do as your abbot commands." Much to everyone's surprise, the abbot came to Matthias's defense. "One moment, Clemens. Matthias speaks sense. Let us hear what he has to say. We are none of us too old to learn." All eyes were turned on the young mouse as Matthias heard himself boldly outline his plans for the defense of Redwall. It was 11 o'clock on that glorious June morning. Mossflower Wood and the meadowlands stirred to the brazen voice of the great Joseph Bell. John Churchmouse heaved on a bell rope as he had been told to by Constance and Matthias. Even the small creatures in wood and field, who could understand no language save their own, knew what the ringing meant. Time of danger, place of sanctuary. Carrying what simple belongings they needed, woodlanders and their families hurried from far and near to gain the safety of the Abbey before the storm of Clooney broke upon them. Squirrels, mice, voles, moles, otters, all save the birds of the air who were safe anyway. Up the long, dusty road they came, mothers protectively herding young ones, while fathers provided a rear guard. Brother Methuselah stood at the gate with the abbot. He translated fully to each group of creatures the abbot's message, in turn, construing it back to the father abbot their grateful thanks with pledges of help and loyalty to Redwall. For what creatures had not been freely given the aid and special knowledge of their kindly mice? All knew that they owed their very existence to the abbot and his community. Healing, aid, food, shelter, and good advice were granted to all. Now is the time to unite and repay, to give any help that was possible. Before much longer, Redwall would require the skills and knowledge of all its woodland allies. They would be gratefully given. Matthias and Constance stood on the top of the high perimeter walls, watching the road. It was noon, and the sun shone directly overhead. Despite the heat, Matthias had ordered all the mice to put on their hoods. It served a double purpose, to shield their eyes from the sun and create a camouflage effect. Silently, each one stood armed with a stout staff. The high red sandstone walls were far too lofty to be scaled by any normal creature. Instinctively, Matthias knew this was a good defense and a formidable deterrent. Constance could feel her hackles beginning to prickle. She sniffed the air and shivered despite the heat that shimmered in waves across the meadowlands. The big badger nudged Matthias. Listen to that. Matthias pricked up his ears and looked at her questioningly. Even the birds have stopped singing, Constance said quietly. The young mouse gripped his staff tighter. Yes, it's silence we can hear. The grasshoppers have gone quiet. Constance peered down the road as she spoke. Strange for a summer day, little friend. Bong! Every creature standing on the ramparts twitched with fright as the loud voice of the Joseph bell rang out and John Churchmouse shouted from his position high in the belfry. They're coming down the road! I can see them! I can see them! Chapter 10. Clooney's army halted at the sound of the Joseph bell. As the dust settled, Fangburn looked to his leader for approval. They're ringing that big bell again, Chief. Ha ha! Maybe they think it'll frighten us off. The warlord's eye rested balefully on his scout. Shut your mouth, fool. If you'd done as I ordered and come right back to report the way Cheese Thief did, you might have been inside that abbey by now. Fangburn slunk back into the ranks. He hoped Clooney had forgotten, but Clooney rarely forgot anything on a campaign. The element of surprise had been lost. Now he must try another ploy, the show of force. The mere sight of a fully armed horde had worked before, and he had little doubt it would prove effective now. Ordinary peaceful creatures were usually panic-stricken at the sight of Clooney the Scourge at the head of his army. The rat was a cunning general, except the times when his mad rage took control of him. But what need of berserk fits for a bunch of silly mice? Clooney knew the value of fear as a weapon, and Clooney was a fearsome figure. His long, ragged black cloak was made of bat wings, fastened at the throat with a mole skull. The immense war helmet he wore had the plumes of a black bird and the horns of a stag beetle adorning it. From beneath the slanted visor, his one eye glared viciously out the abbey before him. Matthias's voice rang out sharp and clear from the high parapet. Halt! Who goes there? Redtooth swaggered forward and took up the challenge in his chief's name as he called back up at the walls. Look well, all creatures, this is the mighty horde of Clooney the Scourge. My name is Redtooth. I speak for Clooney, our leader. Constance's reply was harsh and unafraid. Then speak your piece and be gone, rats. Silence hung upon the air while Redtooth and Clooney held a whispered conference. Redtooth returned to the walls. Clooney the Scourge says he will not deal with badgers. He will only speak with the leaders of the mice. Let us in so that my chief may sit and talk to your chief. Redtooth dodged back as his request was greeted with howls of derision and some loose pieces of masonry from the ramparts. These plump little mice were not as peaceful as they first looked. The rats looked to Clooney, but he was eyeing the abbot who had joined Constance and Matthias. They appeared to be consulting quietly. Clooney watched tensely. There seemed to be some disagreement between the old mouse and his two advisors. They conferred a while, then Matthias came forward to the parapet. He pointed at Clooney and Redtooth with his staff. You there, and you also. My abbot will talk with you both. The rest must remain outside. A rumble of protest from the horde was silenced by a crack from Clooney's tail. He lifted his visor. We agree, Mouse. Let us in. But what about the hostages for safe conduct? Hissed Redtooth. Clooney spat contemptuously. Don't talk foolish talk. Do you imagine a load of mice in funny robes could take me captive? Redtooth gnawed anxiously at a split claw. Maybe not, Chief, but have you cast another eye over that badger? Clooney answered quietly out of the side of his mouth. Don't worry, I've been watching her. A real big country bumpkin. No, these are mice of honor. They'd sooner die than break their word to anyone. You leave this to me. As Clooney and Redtooth made for the gatehouse door, Constance shouted, Put your weapons down, rats! Throw off your armor and show us that you come in peace. Redtooth spluttered angrily. Hell's teeth! Who does that one think she is ordering around? Clooney shot him a warning glance. Quiet! Do as she says. Both rats took off their armor and placed it in a pile on the road. Matthias cried down to Clooney, If you really are Clooney the Scourge, and we know of your tale, it is a weapon. Therefore you will knot it tightly around your waist so that it cannot be used. Clooney laughed mirthlessly. He squinted at Matthias and cracked his tail dramatically. Young mouse, he called. You do right to ask this thing, for truly you are looking at Clooney the Scourge. Having said this, he took his tail in his claws and pulled the poison war spike from its tip. Tossing it on the armor pile, Clooney hitched his tail in a knot around his middle. Now will you let us in, mice? You can see we are unarmed. Ponderously, the heavy gates inched open. The two rats passed through a bristling forest of staves. The gate slammed shut behind them. Clooney mentally estimated the walls to be of immense thickness as he and Redtooth, ducking their heads, emerged from the tunnel like arch into the Abbey grounds, where Constance and Matthias were waiting in the sunlight. The defenders followed the two rats closely, menacing them with staves. Matthias rapped out a curt command. Leave us, mice. Go back to your duties on the wall. Unhappy at leaving the abbot unguarded, the mice hesitated to obey the order to withdraw. Clooney addressed Matthias scornfully. Here, mouse, watch me shift 'em. Suddenly he whirled upon the apprehensive creatures. The single eye rolled madly in its socket as Clooney bared claws and fangs, snarling, Ha-ha! I've got a powerful hunger for mice. You'd best get aloft on those walls. Ha-ha! Clooney leapt into the air. The mice scattered in panic. Constance stopped the proceedings with a loud, angry bark. Here now, enough of that, rat. You are here to talk with the abbot. Get along with you. Matthias was glad he was walking behind the rats. He blushed with shame. Clooney had sent the defenders scattering like butterflies in a whirlwind. Matthias was furious the enemy now knew he was dealing with untrained and untested soldiers. As the party walked towards Cavern Hole, Clooney could sense hostility emanating from the young mouse who flip-flopped behind him in overlarge sandals. Strange for one so young to be counted as a captain, he thought. Moreover, the little fellow didn't seem to fear him. But enough of that. Clooney would deal with him when the time came. Meanwhile, the big rat gazed about his surroundings in secret admiration. What an astounding place. He allowed himself a peek at the future. One day this would be called Clooney's Castle. He liked the sound of that. Secure from attack, living off the fat of the land, in his mind's eye he saw it all. Those mice and the woodland creatures and slaves living just to serve him. He would hold sway as far as the eye could see. Power, an end to his roving days. A dream come true. King Clooney. Entering the Abbey, the party stopped to make way for a pretty little field mouse bearing a tray. Oh, Matthias, she said, I've brought some refreshments for you and... Thank you, Cornflower. Put them down on the table, said Matthias abruptly. Redtooth nudged Clooney. Cornflower, eh? Satan's no, she's a pretty little one for you. Clooney remained silent. He stood insolently watching Cornflower set the table in Cavern Hole. A pretty one indeed. The abbot indicated chairs. They all sat except Clooney, who lounged against the table using the chair as a footstool. He glared at Redtooth until he stood and waited alongside his chief. Idly, Clooney picked up a bowl of honeyed milk and sampled it. Slop! He spat it out on the floor. The abbot folded his paws into the wide sleeves of his habit and stared impassively at the warlord. What do you want at Redwall, Abbey, my son? Clooney kicked the chair over and laughed madly. As the echoes died around him, his face went grim. Your son. Ha! That's a good one. I'll tell you what I want, Mouse. I want it all. The lot. Everything. Do you hear me? Matthias's chair clattered on its side as he sprang forward, breaking free from the restraining paws of the abbot. Listen, rat, you don't scare me, and I'll give you your answer. You get nothing. Now, do you understand that? Shaking with fury, Matthias allowed himself to be pulled back onto the chair. The abbot turned to Clooney. You must forgive Matthias. He is young and headstrong. Now, as to your proposal, I'm afraid it is out of the question. Should you or your army require medical attention, food, clothing, or help upon your way, you will find us only too willing to assist. Clooney interrupted rudely by pounding on the table until the abbot was silenced. He pointed a claw at Redtooth. Read them the articles. Redtooth held up a tattered parchment. He cleared his throat. These are the articles of surrender to be obeyed by all creatures who come under the claw of Clooney the Scourge or any of his commanders. 1. Surrender will be total and unconditional. 2. Clooney will execute the leaders of all who choose to oppose him. 3. All property conquered will belong solely to Clooney the Scourge. This includes homes, food, crops, land, and additionally all creatures dwelling on said property. They shall be owned by Clooney. Thwack! Redtooth got no further. Unable to contain himself, Matthias sent his staff ripping through the middle of the articles. As the torn document fluttered to the floor, Redtooth launched himself at Matthias with a snarl. The rat was actually in midair when a huge, blunt paw knocked him flat. He lay stunned with Constance standing over him. Why pick on a small mouse? Surely a big, strong rat like you can deal with an old badger. Come on, try me for size. It was only the timely intervention of Abbot Mortimer who saved Redtooth's life. Constance, would you please let the rat up? Much as I would like to see him get his just deserts, you must remember we cannot break the law of hospitality in our abbey. Redtooth staggered shakily to his feet, backing warily away from the badger. Clooney spoke as if nothing had occurred. You, Abbot Mouse, you have until tomorrow evening to give me your answer. Not normally given to anger, the abbot stared Clooney in the eye, his face a mask of cold fury. I will not need until tomorrow, rat. You can have my answer now. How dare you come here with your robber band to read articles of death and slavery to me? I tell you that neither you nor your army will ever set paw or claw inside Redwall, not while I or any of my creatures have breath in our bodies to fight and resist you. That is my solemn word. Clooney sneered and turned on his heel, followed by Redtooth. He stamped out. On the stairs between Cavern Hole and Great Hall, he stopped and turned, his cold voice echoing between both chambers. Then die, all of you, every male, female, and young one. You have refused my terms. Now you will suffer the punishment of Clooney. You will beg on your knees for death to come swiftly, and I shall make your torment loud and long before you die. It was then that Constance did something that creatures would speak of in years to come. Exerting the full strength of a female badger, she lifted the massive Cavern Hole dining table. It was a huge, solid oaken thing that no dozen mice could even move. Dishes clattered and food spilled as Constance heaved the table above her head. Her voice was a roar. Get out, rats! Leave this abbey! I'm weary of your voices! Hurry before I break the laws of hospitality and ask the abbot's pardon later. Go while you still have skulls. With the best grace he could muster, Clooney walked rather quickly up the stairs, followed by Redtooth, who laughed nervously. Pig country bumpkins, eh, Chief? One more word from you back there, and she'd have thrown that table and crushed us. Remembering who it was that he had spoken to in this insolent fashion, Redtooth cringed, expecting Clooney to deal him a blow for impudence. But nothing happened. Clooney was standing transfixed. Oblivious to all about him, even Matthias and the abbot who had followed him out, Clooney stood staring at the tapestry. Who is that mouse? He gasped. Matthias followed the direction of the rat's gaze. He walked to the tapestry with his paws outstretched. Do you mean this mouse? Clooney nodded dumbly. Matthias, still with his paw outstretched, declared proudly, This is Martin the Warrior. He founded our order, and I'll tell you something else, Rat. Martin was the bravest mouse that ever lived. If he were here today, he'd just take up his big sword and send you and all your bullies packing. Those of you he didn't chop up into crow meat. Much to everyone's surprise, Clooney allowed himself to be shown out. He was like one in a daze, all the way back to the gatehouse. A hush fell over the mice on guard as Clooney and Redtooth were led out onto the road. Swiftly the horde gathered around the warlord and his lieutenant. They awaited orders. Deputizing for Clooney, Redtooth called out, Form up! Back to the church, everyone! Clooney marched automatically, shaking his head in disbelief. Martin the Warrior, the mouse who pursued him through his nightmares. What did it mean? As Redtooth marched away, a voice hailed him from the wall. He turned and looked upwards. The torn articles, the parchments wrapped around a fistful of rotting vegetables, splattered in his face. Livid with rage, he clawed the foul mess from his eyes and saw Constance leaning over the parapet with a wicked grin of delight on her striped muzzle. The Badger shouted mockingly, Don't forget to call again, Rat. I'd be delighted to see you. You've got some unfinished business that I'm looking forward to settling. Just you and me, Redtooth. Before the rat could reply, she had vanished from sight. All right, guys, we're going to leave off there for today. Clooney the Scourge has officially declared war on Redwall Abbey. How will the mice handle this crisis? Let's find out next time. Bye, guys.